I'm Danielle Smith with the Alberta Enterprise Group. We're collaborating with Common Sense Edmonton to interview candidates for the upcoming municipal election for Edmonton City Council. And joining me is the candidate in Ward 4, Tricia Velthuizen. Tricia, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So tell me, you're running for a newly named ward. What ward are you running for?
So right now the ward is Ward 4, but with the name change and the boundary redesign, we are the Dene ward. And actually what's really interesting is this ward is the sole ward in the city that does not see any geographic boundary changes, which is really nice. I ran 4 years ago as well, so it means I'm in the same area. And Dene, for those who don't know, means people of land and water. And we have in the Northeast here too, we're in a bit of the bend of the river, and it's just a beautiful place.
Tricia, I have a fear that I said your last name incorrectly. Can you just say your name correctly, just in case I need to be corrected?
Sure, it was very close. It's Velthuizen.
Velthuizen. Okay, we want to make sure people know that. Now, you did say that you ran before 4 years ago. So tell us, what are some of the reasons that you're putting your name forward now? What are you hearing are the main issues in the ward?
Yeah, sure. So just like 4 years ago, I love the city. I love Northeast Edmonton. I grew up in Northeast Edmonton, have been in a couple communities, but always have found myself in this area of town, and I love it. And, you know, a number of the issues are the same as they were 4 years ago. Some of them are different. I mean, you will also have that with different councillors at the helm. But a lot of people just concerned, honestly, hearing a lot about tax increases, hearing a lot right now about the fact that City Council seems to have an agenda that doesn't match with what regular Edmontonians want. So people feel they're not really being listened to. And I just think that City Council, we need a change, and we need a new way of doing things.
Talk to me a bit. You're running up against incumbent Aaron Paquette. When you look at the decisions he's made, is there anything that you would have done differently?
It's interesting that you mentioned this. Now, I know that these interviews will be posted later, but most common right now, most top of mind is the mask mandate. Just yesterday, City Council had a debate on this, and the mask mandate was voted 7-6 in favor of lifting when the province moves into its stage 3 reopening. And on third reading, which was more procedural and needed to be a unanimous vote, Councillor Paquette was the one person who voted against that, which means that we need to go back and bring this back again. So that's just really disappointing. I've heard a number of people, they're ready to move on. There certainly some people still have that fear and concern, but I worry that the longer we live under the shadow of the pandemic and under the shadow of having to wear a mask everywhere and it being mandatory, instead of people having the choice to make their own decision, the harder it will be to move forward ultimately. And one thing that we really need to work on right now as a city is moving forward out of the pandemic. What does that post-pandemic recovery look like? What does a post-pandemic Edmonton look like? And we need to get back to life.
All right. Let me talk to you a little bit about what you think a post-pandemic Edmonton looks like, because even pre-pandemic, Alberta was suffering because of the decline in oil and gas prices and all of our economies, but Edmonton in particular, because of the reliance on energy, was impacted as well. Tell me what you think needs to be done to get the economy kick-started again.
Sure thing. So one thing, again, top of mind, that's been a problem for a number of years, is the city has an atrocious amount of red tape. If you go back 2 years ago, there was Fire and Flower, the cannabis company. They ran into a number of red tape issues trying to open up stores on, I think it was Jasper Avenue. Bump forward another couple years, you have a brewery that would love to expand into Edmonton, but can't because of the red tape. Right in my ward, there is the Transit Hotel, that has been purchased by a group of people, and they're trying to renovate it and rebuild it and turn it around. I've been following their social media account, and they were hoping to open in time for New Year's. They're still not open. We are a full 6 months later, and it's because business permitting and licensing and process is taking far too long. And it's more than just business. If you look at last summer, I believe it was, there was a story about a supportive housing unit in West Edmonton that had the funding approved, had the land, and was in danger of losing that federal funding because of the city's processes and permitting. This is unacceptable. We need to get that under control. We need to make sure that Edmonton is a place people want to come to. If you can't do business here, people won't do business here. And then we won't get those jobs, and we won't have as strong of a recovery. And
let me ask you those are great comments. Let me ask about a couple more things that can be done to make the environment better for business, to see what you think about those. You've talked about reducing the number of permits. Other municipalities, or the permitting time, I should say, the other municipalities have looked at a proactive way of supporting businesses by setting aside funds to do business attraction, actually giving direct grants or subsidies. Do you favor that type of approach?
I think that it's the overall environment. If you look at, I don't want to stray into other levels of politics here, but if you look at the difference provincially that has happened in the past couple years here, where corporate taxes have been reduced and the overall environment is better, and we have all sorts of, for example, green energy come in. Not long ago, there was a hydrogen announcement that also takes place right kind of on the outskirts edge of my ward here. We need the overall environment. I don't think it's necessarily about giving businesses money to say, hey, come here. It's about the overall attraction. And if I look at, for example, Strathcona County, which neighbors my ward, they have a ton of, especially that larger industrial development too. And with the taxes that are paid by those large companies and industries, that offsets what the property taxes are for regular, John and Mary and everybody else. So I think we need to look at what is the full package? What is the full package? And that, I know that not long ago, the city voted to, I believe it was halve the business license fee for a year or so. And I think that's a great idea too. Let's do what we can, because so many people are struggling now. But we also can't afford to just be giving out subsidies.
Okay. Let me ask you about a couple more things then. We'll get into taxes a bit more in detail in just a second. But before I leave the issue of oil and gas, I'm wondering what the future of oil and gas looks like in your mind. Do you still think that there is the ability to have oil and gas provide good jobs in the future in the area?
100%. And actually, there are a number of families in this ward that are oil and gas workers and commute up to Fort McMurray. We're on the upper corner of the northeast part of the city. And I remember 4 years ago too, knocking on a lot of doors, and people are directly affected by that. I think that, yes, there is a demand for oil and gas products. There's a demand for ethical oil and gas products, and that is beneficial to us. Is there eventually a transition? Sure, we're seeing, if you look at the market too, and all of Alberta has been seeing a lot of green energy investment, and that's fantastic, but we let the market decide, and there is still a market for oil and gas, and I'm confident that we can rely on those jobs.
All right.
For a number of years still.
Thank you for that. All right, let's talk a little bit about the relationship with City Hall. So you're running to play an oversight role of the city administration. So just give us an idea of the kind of things that you've done in your working life that you think will make you a good council member.
Sure thing. So I have come a long road, I suppose, to being involved in politics, and that includes working in the public service, working in the private sector, working for nonprofits as well. I've kind of covered all of that, and I think the different roles that I've had there in the different sectors does help give me an overall better look. I think also that my work at the provincial level in politics has also given me a really great understanding of how that works, how governance works, what it looks like, and the tough decisions that need to be made.
Okay, let me then talk about the role of municipal government. What do you think the core business of the city is?
I think it is, we need to provide the services, our core services for Edmontonians. And we also need to learn to stay in our lane a little bit. And we need to make sure that we are providing an overall environment that business can succeed and that investment comes in order to effectively grow our city in more than just population numbers.
All right. I know you've mentioned this on your website, but the number of managers has grown over the last number of years since 2017, 22% more middle management, 19% more supervisors. What do you think can be done about that?
You know, we also, I'm really happy to see that we have a new city manager. He's been in the job for a couple months now, and I think that Mr. Corbould has a really strong background and strength in management, and I'm looking forward to what he can bring more to the table now. I think that at the end of the day, we need to have that better oversight by council. Where is this money going to? What is this? If what I'm hearing is that people are frustrated by slow or poor or lacking frontline services, why is that? If our numbers, if our hiring numbers are going up, but we're getting less service, where is that? I'm someone who likes to dig into some of that nitty gritty that comes also from work experience. And it doesn't take much. It's not the role of city council to say, this is where you're hiring and this is the level, but we do need to ask the harder questions of those who are in charge.
Okay, let me ask you about, I want to sort of try to get a handle on the issue of spending and taxes at City Hall. And one of the big ticket items, of course, is labor. So we've talked about one part of that, the issue of managers. But what about the front line? Oftentimes multi-year collective bargaining agreements get signed that have sequential pay increases. Plus, as you go up the grid, you end up paying more. Is there any different approach that you think the city should be taking to negotiating its frontline service contracts?
Let me be perfectly clear right off the top here. We do have a good, strong public service, and we 100% need to respect the collective bargaining process. That being said, we do also need to push back a bit. I worked for 5 years at the Edmonton Public Library, really enjoyed all my time there. But it's also the only time in my career that I got increases solely based on the number of hours worked. And I don't think that's an effective way. I think we do need to look at elements in our collective bargaining agreements and say what makes sense. This is not to say that we don't value time put in by frontline workers. And it's not to say that we don't value their expertise, because we do, but I think there should be, and we should be pushing for a more reasonable use of how people progress through the different pay bands and what the criteria are that we're looking at. And again, at the end of the day, we do need to respect that collective bargaining agreement and work with. There needs to be collaboration between the city administration and the unions, and then of course city council's oversight.
Okay, well, let's talk about city council pay. So if you get elected, have you probably taken a look at the wages and benefits and the whole package? Do you think it's fair, or do you think that there should be some cuts there?
I think that it is fair. I think that at the municipal level, the salaries are set by an independent board or process, and so I think that it's entirely more reasonable to count on that than if municipal councillors were sitting there saying, hey, we deserve to be paid X amount. There is, having worked in politics for 6 years now, there's a ton of work that goes on. And I think that, and it's not a 9 to 5, and I think that there should be fair compensation for that. And I think that the salary level where that is at now, and I'll note that 4 years ago, they also removed the tax-free portion of that salary. So I think we're in a good place.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more then about spending in other areas. Generally speaking, do you think that the city is spending the right amount? Is it too much? Is it too little?
What I think is that the city is paying for things that we don't need to be paying for. That's not to say that what we're spending money on isn't good, and that the programs, etc., are not worthy. However, we have 3 different levels of government, and each level of government is responsible for different things. And no matter how good something might be, the city cannot continue to pick up the tab for what other levels of government may or may not be doing to the city's satisfaction. The city is responsible for things like roads, like your waste, your water, your emergency services, your communities. We can't spend on things that are not our responsibility. We don't have the money, and we can't keep asking Edmontonians to pay more in taxes to cover pieces that the city should not be spending on.
All right. You've already talked a bit about the tax environment and regulatory environment for business, but give me a sense of what you think ought to be done on residential taxes. For the first time since 1997, there was a tax freeze, but over that period of time, we've calculated that on the average home, the property tax levy went from $910 in 2000 to $2,500 in 2019. So do you think that's a problem, or do you think that that's a level of tax burden that residents are prepared to pay?
No, it's not. We can only take in so much money, and the taxpayer, there's one taxpayer at the end of the day for 3 levels of government, and we can only afford so much. Even the auditor, the city auditor, in his report from November, I believe it was, said that Edmontonians can only afford to be taxed so much. I'm really happy to see that we have frozen taxes this past year, but that needs to be more than just a one-off. And this again comes in, if we were spending more appropriately, if we weren't overspending our operational spending by far more than population growth and inflation, maybe it becomes right away something that we don't automatically look at, okay, well, how large is the increase? We can look at more, no, we can stay the line because we're focusing on the things we need to focus on. And that's what Edmontonians want us to focus on.
All right.
It's all about a new way of doing things.
Well, okay, just a little bit more on taxes, because from time to time, new tax powers comes up as a topic of discussion, whether it's in the context of city charters or in looking at what other municipalities are doing across the country. Do you think Edmonton needs new sources of revenue and new tax powers?
I don't think that we need the new taxpayers. I think, unfortunately, from councils past, we've seen that just opens up the door. If we have new powers, we will use them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a slippery slope to go down that we don't need to. Again, if we can get our spending in line, we can if we can better manage the money that we have and that we can count on, we don't need to be having these conversations about new taxing powers. You can't look and only say, how can we get more money, without saying, what are we spending on right now? And is it appropriate? We need to look at that as well.
So you've talked a bit about staying in the lane and having the municipality focus on municipal issues. Now let me ask you about the provincial role in asking you to be their tax collector, because a portion of the bill is the education portion of property tax. Do you think that is a reasonable way to continue funding education, or do you think that relationship needs to be looked at?
I think that everything should be looked at to make sure it still makes sense. I don't really have a problem with the city collecting that portion. Does that need to be looked at? We can certainly look at that and we can have conversations. But I think at the end of the day, how that tax money is paid, where that tax money is paid, is less of an issue than what we're spending our portion of the taxes that we collect, what we're spending that on.
Okay, let me get on to talking about the other large part of the budget, which is the capital budget. The Valley Line Southeast has suffered multiple significant delays during its construction. Give us some idea of whether there is a process change that you think should be done differently to avoid those kind of delays on future projects.
So I know that a number of years ago, the city looked into, for a number of projects, if they were delayed, then the developers would have to pay back part of it. And there was kind of that financial incentive or decentive, depending which way you look at it, to do projects on time. Again, you mentioned the Valley Line LRT. I'm a proponent of public transportation. I've relied on it for a number of years solely. I have traveled and lived places where there is phenomenal public transit. We appear to have a bit of tunnel vision on projects like this. LRT is convenient, but it's perhaps not affordable. And so let's look at bus rapid transit, for example. We are so far, Edmonton is so far behind in public transportation that to think that we can suddenly catch up to somewhere, a level of service that we should have been at years ago, to think we can suddenly catch up as the city continues to grow and expand is just not realistic. So we need to look more smartly at how we're doing things overall.
Well, so let me ask you then, because you've offered some alternatives to support public transit, but there are still big plans to build the Valley Line West, Metro Line Northwest, Capital Line South. Are you suggesting that bus rapid transit should be instead of those projects, or in addition to, or as a first step, and those ones should be delayed? How do you see the rollout of LRT?
I think now I should clarify at the outset, I'm not sure with those routes and growing out, I'm not sure if we are at a phase yet that to cancel a project would be even worse than going forward. So that would definitely need to come into consideration. But BRT needs to be considered. And I think in some of these cases would have been a smarter option than the LRT. Maybe it is not as sexy as LRT, but it is as effective and possibly more so. And it's certainly more taxpayer dollar friendly.
All right, thanks for that. Let's talk a little bit about your community and the Edmonton City Plan in particular, where they talk about having 15-minute communities. And I want to get a sense from the communities you represent. If you were to think through, do you have all the amenities that you need in the area? What would you say are areas that are missing that to be able to achieve that 15-minute community goal?
So At the outset, I think that 15-minute communities are a little idealistic, and I'm not sure that they entirely make sense. I happen to live in a part in my ward that I'm very close to everything I could possibly want and more. That is not entirely true of everywhere in the ward, that's for sure. But I think that we do have Northeast Edmonton has everything that you could want, with the possible exception of not very many high schools in the area. But we need to look overall at making the entire city a place that Edmontonians want. If we focus too strongly simply on, hey, we need these 15-minute communities, that strikes me as a top-down approach, as opposed to communities saying, hey, this works for us, or hey, we'd actually like to see this. And I think you need that to be more community-led and less top-down city.
All right, let's just continuing with development for a minute. When everyone says they support affordable housing, but I'm wondering what that term means to you.
So I think that everybody who is currently houseless or homeless in the city, and if they want to move into housing, if they want a more permanent, safe solution, I think that it's important that there are options available. I do believe that we need to be clear, this is a provincial responsibility, and this is one thing that we need to have a better relationship with the province for, and perhaps better present better business plans or something to get the funding for that. At the end of the day, you can't force anybody anywhere, but it is definitely about having those options and those supports in place so that people who want to move on and in and forward in that way have that ability.
All right. Let me ask another aspect of affordability, which is that first-time home buyer. And oftentimes it's more affordable to get a home in a more dense neighborhood in an outlying area with greenfield development than in the inner city. But there's always this tension of, do you densify and build up, or do you build out? And I want to get your sense of how you would strike that balance.
And I think you touched on that right there, is the need for balance. We also have to be careful that I love mature neighborhoods. I grew up in a mature neighborhood, big yard, mature trees. It was lovely, and I love them. We need to be cautious that we don't create a bit of a donut within the city, in that you have a desirable downtown core, and then right at the outside you have that growth and a lot of people growing there, but in the current mature neighborhoods that you don't have people there. And so I know that infill is a hot topic and people feel very passionately about it. We cannot completely discount infill development, just like we can't stop people from moving out further if they want to. It's not my choice. It's not my decision or my responsibility to tell people this is where you can live and this is where you can't. This is what we're doing. People need to be able to make that decision for themselves based on what they want and what their family needs.
All right. Let me ask you about the latch for development now, because the city has taken that on as their own developer. Do you think that's a good idea?
No, the city should not be in the role of that type of development. That's not the city's job. This is just another example of the city not staying in its lane. There are experts who do this work. Let's let the experts do it, and let's have the city focus on what the city actually needs to do.
Okay, a few other questions just to wrap up. These are not really related issues, but there are issues that have been in the news over the last year. Let me begin with the issue of defund the police. That was what the movement called itself. But what does that mean to you?
So I think we need to be clear on two things. Number one, I'm a supporter of our Edmonton Police Service. I think they do great work. If and where there are problems, those need to be 100% addressed, but we don't address that by defunding. Number two, I know that there are people who will say, no. Defund the police doesn't mean fully defund. It means reduce funding. And that's simply not true. The defund the police movement is exactly that. It's defund the police. Now, certainly you have people all across that spectrum, some people who think we don't need a police service, which I would argue we've seen in cities across the states is not true. In Edmonton, there was an article, I think it was 2 days ago, that Edmonton homicides have reached the point they are from a year ago. Crime is up. We can't afford to defund, and that's just not an option. And then you have people who say, well, you know what, let's reduce the funding. And I would say to that too, you are also asking for so much more from our police service. You want more community policing. You want to make sure that there's this additional training. Those things all cost money. And at the end of the day, when somebody calls 911 for police assistance, they want to know that someone is there to take their call and to respond. And we don't get there by defunding. I know a couple months ago, I saw for the first time a police help. It's I'm going to get the acronym wrong. I can't even remember. I'm going to stop there. But it is a more community-led unit that I believe works with Boyle Street, if I'm not mistaken. We have the NET, the neighborhood empowerment teams with police. There are a number of initiatives that are being done, and we should support those. At the end of the day, our men and women in blue need to know that we have their backs. We appreciate what they do. We appreciate their work. Again, if there are problems, those 100% need to be addressed, but we don't get there by cutting funding.
All right. Let me ask you about enforcement of a different sort, because the city voted to drop the residential speed limits to 40 kilometers per hour. Some wanted to go to 30 kilometers per hour. What do you think?
I think that 40 kilometers an hour is where that conversation should end. In school zones and playground zones, of course, we have that 30 kilometer an hour limit. I have spoken to some people in some of the communities here that do have concerns about some of the thoroughfares and how quickly people are driving through. And that needs to be looked at. But to drop still further to 30, we need to remember that we have a shared responsibility when it comes to road and traffic safety, and that's definitely drivers. That's also cyclists and pedestrians. We all have a shared responsibility there.
Okay, let me ask another question now about the role of the private sector. Edmonton's garbage collection is already half of it's private. A discussion of golf courses, is that the business that the city should be in running? Do you think that there is a role for the private sector in those areas? Do you think the role of the private sector could be expanded in delivering public services?
Sure. So again, at the outset, obviously, we need to respect the collective bargaining process and agreements. But I think that in order to ensure that Edmontonians are getting the best value and the best service, everything needs to be looked at. And there may be some situations where, for example, in golf courses, that makes more sense to look at the private model there. We need to look at everything. We need a new way of doing things to make sure that Edmontonians are getting the best value for the high taxes that we pay.
All right. You said you worked for the library for 5 years. I'm looking at a picture of the new think tank library downtown. So it's a bit of a fun question. Love it or hate it?
Hate the design, love the library. How's that? I haven't been inside there yet. I do think that the library does good work. I really enjoyed my time there, and especially a number of the programs. I think the design is definitely unfortunate, but it is what we have right now. And so let's focus a little bit more on what's going on the inside.
All right, you got it. Let's just in our final questions here move to. Oh, you know what? One more question I had to ask you before I move to the question of the role of an elected member of council. There was a controversial decision that was made on the issue of approving a solar project in the River Valley for EPCOR. If you had been on council, what would you have voted?
I don't think that the River Valley is a place for the development that some people are looking at. I think, so solar energy is important, and certainly we can support people making that decision. I don't believe that the River Valley is the place to do it.
Okay, so to the issue of the role of the elected council member, in the fall, we're also going to see a provincial referendum on the issue of equalization. No municipal referendum questions in Edmonton, although there are some in other cities. Let me ask you, generally speaking, about putting questions directly to the people. Do you think that is a good approach to address some issues, or do you think as an elected council member that you should be making all the decisions that come up at the city level?
If we're not engaging with the citizens of Edmonton, if we're not engaging with Edmontonians, then we don't know what decisions to make. I think I have no problem with having a referendum at the same time as the municipal election. I think certainly not every decision needs to go to that level, but I think it's important to engage. And for some pieces that are perhaps especially contentious or especially could change the path that we're going down, or fundamentally change the way we do things, I think that there's definitely an argument to be made that it is worthy of a referendum question. And I think that voters are smart, and we can trust them to tell us what they think is important and to give us direction on where to go.
Okay. Now, sometimes you will get advice. Oftentimes, you'll get advice from the city administration, and sometimes they'll recommend something that they say will be best for the city as a whole, but your constituents will want you to vote another way. What would you do in those cases?
So again, I think it's important to engage with citizens and with Edmontonians directly in the ward. This is their city. This needs to make sense. And for example, if we look at the whole issue, and I almost hesitate to bring it up, but if we look at the whole issue of bike lanes, that's something that maybe makes sense for downtown, where a number of people who live there and work there, it's an easy mode of transportation. For me, living out in Northeast Edmonton, it doesn't make sense, and it makes going downtown far more difficult. And in addition, there was recently a poll that came out that said only 26% of Edmontonians supported expanding the bike lane network. But you hear a lot of conversation at City Council about this is what we need to do. We need to expand bike lanes. They need to be everywhere. That's clearly out of step with what Edmontonians want. So we need to push back. Administration, the people working there have a lot of knowledge and expertise, but they are not the elected officials, and the elected officials are the ones who are elected to take a look at that and to consult with their constituents and make those decisions.
All right. Thanks so much for the conversation today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. This was great.
That is your candidate, Tricia Velthuizen. She's your candidate for Ward 4, Dene.